Hello.
Hi, how are you?
So, can everybody see us and hear us? This is Dr. Hannah Moots, and you are at Stockholm University. Am I getting that right? Or University of Stockholm? One of those two.
Yeah, I'm at the Center for Paleogenetics, which is joint between the Natural History Museum here and Stockholm University. So,
Okay,
yeah, my office
perfect.
is yeah.
I've been to Stockholm very briefly. I was in the airport on my way to Uppsala for a conference, a really
Oh,
cool conference. But okay,
it's a
so
cool city. I'll have to check
are
it out.
are you you don't sound Swedish. You sound American.
No, I'm from the US. Yeah.
Okay. And so, so you're. I just got your stuff. Let me pop that in my PowerPoint. And if you want to introduce yourself really quickly in your research, I mean, obviously you do awesome genetics of ancient Rome and Italy and the Mediterranean, and then you can talk more
Yeah.
about that.
Oh, thanks for saying that. Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to work with a big team. I mean, all ancient DNA studies involve, big teams of folks. So I've been lucky enough to work with a big team to study back in 2019 the genetic history of Rome. So we put together a time transect to sort of track the rise and fall of Rome and the people moving into and moving around that world. And so that was a team from Rome and Sardinia and Vienna and California. And then we had a couple follow-up papers, one trying to look at the Mediterranean more broadly in that time period, and then another one looking at the Iron Age. And for the paper on the Iron Age, we specifically focused on the central Mediterranean, especially because there are connections between, for example, Italy and Tunisia in that period that are really important. And we felt like that would be nice to include those together rather than have them separate papers or sort of in this bigger Mediterranean paper.
So here we go. So and I have your paper as well, the latest one.
Oh,
I can show that somewhere, I think. But what are we looking at here? So this is basically looking at relatedness of different people.
So this is principal component analysis. And
Mm-hmm.
so sort of the gray points represent modern genomes. So this is sort of how we can build a reference space in PCA.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially what PCA does is take something that's really complicated, which is the human genome, which is 3 billion base pairs, and condenses it down into 2D visual space. So in some ways, it's really nice to get a good overview of our data, but then you're always going to want to do sort of follow-up analyses. Maybe this is a good way to generate some hypotheses that you can test with other analyses.
So what
Um,
are the different colors?
yeah, so the top row is Bronze Age mostly, and then the central
Ah,
one is North African late Neolithic because there's at the time was no Bronze Age data from North Africa. And then the second row, the lower row in green is Iron Age. And so you can see one thing that strikes me visually here is that in the top row, populations cluster more in each time period. So if you look at the Sardinia one, you can see Sardinia, all the individuals are very close together in the Bronze Age. And then in the Iron Age, they're quite spread out in this principal component analysis space. And you can see the modern populations there are
that's what I was going
Mediterranean.
to ask. So the gray
Yeah,
parts for everybody, they're modern populations that we've gotten from large-scale studies of modern people living in those
yeah.
areas. Okay, and so it's basically how close-ish statistically they relate, at least plotted out with principal PCA, principal correspondence analysis. Okay, so what we're seeing over time, if I'm going to do a quick stab at this, is as you said with Sardinia, it actually seems to be the case kind of everywhere. We see a lot more genetic diversity. So that would suggest people have moved around, and there's a lot more sort of mingling showing up in the Iron Age, which would make sense from the archaeological evidence we have too, where we see more mobility, we see more trade in goods, we see the movement of animals and plants around and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing that's interesting about this time period is it's when you have a little bit earlier than this the invention of sails on the Nile in Egypt, and then that gets taken out into the Mediterranean Sea, this new sailing technology, and allows people to move around more intensively or more often than they had before. So it's sort of a shift in how people are connecting at this
Okay.
time period.
And well, by this time period, you're saying over a long stretch of time, of course,
Yeah,
over thousands of
yeah,
years.
absolutely right. People didn't immediately sail from the Nile, but yeah. I mean, that this technology was developed and improved over time, and it let people, in 1000 BCE to like 1 BCE move around a lot more than they had in the preceding period.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And this is the citation to the paper that was published in 2023. This is the one,
Hmm.
yeah. And so it's basically looking at the genetic history of these different populations in these periods and comparing them over time to get this sense of mobility and diversity and the relatedness of these different groups of people. So what's the total sample size you have here, and how many different sites?
Yeah, so this was 4 different sites, and it's 30 new genomes total. And then we used additional published genomes from other papers. So there's been some exciting other papers by Poth et al. On the Etruscans, by Saup et al. On northern and central Italy. Let's see, there's several on Sardinia as well by, let me get the authors, Marcus Ringbauer and Poth, and then also Fernandez
Okay.
et al. I think, yeah, both 2020. So we
So it's
brought together.
presenting some new genomes, and it's doing a larger data synthesis of what's available. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to sort of see how people were moving around, especially this connection between, this was the time that Carthage was growing, and there's different takes on whether Carthage was sort of a proper empire or sort of a trading hub at the center of this big trading network. But either way, the Western Mediterranean becomes much more connected as Carthage rises. The sailing technology, becomes really powerful. Of course, they're a hub of trade and a hub of I guess culture, you would say, in that region. So they're sort of a big maritime power at the time, and so that's one thing that's bringing people together.
Okay.
And then of course, yeah.
And with the Phoenicians going across and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So, okay, let's walk through your second figure then. So this is still doing PCA, something similar therefore, but you're representing it differently, is how I'm seeing this, right?
Yeah, this is just a sort of stepping through time. This is all, in this figure, is all data from central Italy, so specifically just central Italy. But you can see in the Chalcolithic, or the Copper Age, as we've called it here, the main component is this Anatolian Neolithic farmer component. It's this ancestry that came in as people transitioned to farming from hunting and gathering. You can also see ancestry from hunter-gatherers. And then you can see this change through time in the Bronze Age, where the steppe ancestry comes in, and that's ancestry from the Eurasian steppe. It's thought that that was spread mostly by land, so people moving over land. So you have actually less in Italy than in most places elsewhere in Europe because of the Alps. So there's a little bit of less steppe ancestry there. And then
What's
in
the
the Iron
difference
Age.
of each of these bars in here?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So these are each an individual genome. So each bar
Okay, that
represents
makes
an
sense.
individual genome. Yeah.
And are
And then
these
these
all people that you studied from these are the ones that you're introducing plus the compilation of ones from other publications?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So we could sort of get as robust of a possible data set for studying these changes. Yeah. And then you see in the Iron Age, and then especially the Imperial period, as you have sailing become this primary way of people moving around, this increase in diversity or heterogeneity of the population. So you see one individual in the Bronze Age, and it's 5 individuals there. So it's a small sample set, of course, but one who's looking at least, using these ancestry components that we've picked to model this population a little different from the others. And then in the Iron Age and Imperial period, there's a lot of diversity.
Yeah, no, that's actually phenomenal to be able to see that, and you can see that with each individual plotted. So, all right, but obviously there's the issue of sample size, right? So you have just a few from those early periods, which makes it, if you had grabbed any, I guess, 4 individuals from the later period, you'd have a reasonable chance they'd look homogeneous. So how do you account for that then? Is that part of the next step to do more of these earlier genomes since there's fewer represented here? Or is it just because there's less DNA preserved from those earlier periods because they're more degraded?
There's a couple different things. So there are other papers coming out, and I was actually just at the EAAs, which is the European Association of Archaeology, and there was a whole day devoted to Italian ancient DNA, which was excellent. So there will be, I think, a lot of papers in the nearish future about that. So I think there will be more data from a whole bunch of different labs coming out about this period, which is really exciting.
So the picture will become bigger in a bigger way. I mean, I personally think that probably this pattern will continue showing up. We do know, like I said, from a range of different archaeological evidence that mobility increases, and so that would certainly make a lot of sense that you see that kind of population mobility as well. But yeah, I think having more data and nuance is always a good thing, right?
Yeah, and especially for a city as big as Rome, when you get to the imperial period, Rome, it's estimated had a population of 1 million people. So even when you say, oh, we had 150, which is rounding up to maybe 127 genomes from Roman, even from the imperial period. Our 2019 paper had 48 or so. It can sound like a lot until you put it in the context of the whole city, and then you say a million, a
And
million
it's a
people.
million over like 500 years.
Right? Do some calculus.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a whole lot of people. And then I mean, if you read even like Nick Terranato's article from a long time ago on the demography of Rome, a lot of people are dying very young anyway. So there's very rapid population turnover, particularly among less wealthy, less elite people. And so that's going to have a different kind of biasing effect on your sample and who gets a burial, so you can even find them.
Yeah.
All this kind of stuff matters. Okay, let's check out your third image, and you can try to walk us through this one.
Great.
Okay, so what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so this is QPADM modeling. So this is essentially modeling. You pick sort of different source components similar to that. So again, each bar represents an individual here. It's horizontal. And so you're sort of choosing ancestral components, so these different ancestry sources, and then also providing a set of outgroups. And essentially what you're doing is saying, oh, here's a tree-like structure. And then we're testing sort of where each of these individuals would be in that tree. So essentially, if they could be modeled as a single population, like you can see with the individuals from Morocco from the late Neolithic period. And we use them as one of the sources, but you can see there sort of that's the complete ancestry model for the individuals. And then you can see that's true for a few other individuals from Sardinia, for instance, or from Kherkouan, which is this site in Tunisia from the Iron Age. Some individuals can be modeled at least in this tree structure, as the same as this Morocco late Neolithic population. So that would be the blue horizontal bars. But then you can see admixture in a lot of individuals between these different sources.
Okay.
And so this is, again, just comparing the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. So showing, how heterogeneous the Iron Age is compared to the preceding period.
Perfect. I think that's so. Okay, I came across this when we saw some people going a little crazy on Twitter about this. And because all right, we're learning a lot about these ancient Roman people. That's something I should ask. Sorry, before we go into the Twitter stuff. So, do we have any sense of who these people were? Do they have gravestones, or do they have an archaeological context that could even let us compare them by social class or gender? I mean, you have the ADNA, so you should be able to look at their biological sex at least. Is there a difference in that sense within these populations that adds to the picture?
It was a little difficult to a lot of the individuals we studied had been excavated a while ago, and so some of that information wasn't preserved, although
Okay.
there are some information about sites in general. So one of the sites we were so lucky to study, and this site is curated by Luca Bondioli and Alessandro Sperduti, and it's Isla Sacra, which is the necropolis for the main port of Rome. So the main port of Rome was Ostia, and then the bigger port, Portus, was built, and there's a necropolis in between them. And it's thought that was probably, it's been suggested, I think, by Peter Garnsey, that it was sort of an egalitarian structure in that town, and that it would have mostly been merchants, traders. And so we were so lucky to study, it was over 20 individuals from that necropolis. And there was also isotopic work done on those individuals to look at mobility. And it was found that about a third had grown up outside of central Italy, about 2/3 had grown up in central Italy. But then when we looked at the ancestry, many had ancestry. I mean, clearly they grew up in central Italy, because that's isotopically, that seems to be where they grew up. But they had ancestries from outside of central Italy. So, what that's saying to us is that there were multi-generational families coming to central Italy, settling there, having families there. And so that's why you're getting these ancestries from the Levant, from North Africa, from Iberia, but then getting these local isotopes.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you next. So a lot of these have also had some isotopic data done that suggests that they're sort of if they've moved within their lives, or at least between when their teeth grew and their bones formed lately.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So that adds to the picture as well. And I think that kind of multiple approach with different methods also strengthens it. So wait, what's your training? Was your training on this coming entirely from genetics into archaeology, or is it from archaeology into genetics, or from ancient history down to genetics? What's your training?
In archaeology, yeah. So my background's in archaeology, but I became interested in, sort of the relationship between people and their environments, particularly with domestication. But so that led me to start becoming interested in ancient DNA. Yeah, and so then in my PhD, I was lucky enough to get involved in this project. And in this project, I did a lot of the lab work. So I was lucky enough to go to an ancient DNA lab. Ron Panassi's lab was first in Dublin and then in Vienna,
Okay.
do a lot of the DNA extraction, building the libraries. Yeah, and I was also lucky enough to travel to Rome and visit a lot of the sites that we worked on as well. Yeah, so sort of moved from archaeology into the data generation part of that, and then since then have been developing my computational skills as well. That's been fun.
So, among some archaeologists, geneticists have this bad reputation of just swooping in and grabbing stuff and then just making up sort of narratives, let's say. So, how do you negotiate that? Because you're coming at it from archaeology, now you're doing the genetics, but of course you're working in the lab and you're working with, I'd assume, some osteoarchaeologists or bioarchaeologists that are helping you select samples. So, how do you sort of negotiate that kind of difference between these disciplines and between, obviously, some of the data you have is from very old excavations, so there's not as much good context, but some of it has that kind of context. So, how do you negotiate those kind of challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I'm excited about is sort of how the relationships between archaeology and genetics seem to be deepening, so that
Hmm.
people are collaborating more. I mean, that was one of the things I was so excited about from this recent conference I mentioned, was that it does seem like people are collaborating more, and I think that's also sort of bringing out these more nuanced narratives about the past. I mean, one that's really relevant to, these periods we're talking about, the Iron Age, the Roman period, is how we talk about mobility. I think before, it was easy to talk about migration specifically. I think for a couple of reasons. One, because the terminology of migration is really common in biology. So in biology and PopGen, lots of things are referred to as migration. Like caribou migrating seasonally, for instance, for the winter might be called, or birds, of course. But for humans, we have this much deeper language about different types of mobility. So seasonal mobility, yeah, you can move for different reasons. You can move for work, move for political reasons. There's, of course, forced movement and slavery. And so we have this sort of much deeper and nuanced language about mobility. And so I'm really excited that recent papers have sort of adopted that and tried to be more nuanced, when we're talking about mobility. I think it's important for the political implications too, if we have sort of specific words for what we're talking about, to use those and sort of not use migration when something else might. And I mean, sometimes it is, but we should
Yeah, yeah.
choose our
Well, I mean,
carefully.
exactly. And I think that's where a lot of the bad rap came from. A lot of the early genetics papers were, they really came off as like cultural history from like the 1930s. And so it's just like a bunch of arrows on maps and it's just migration. And it's like, this is obviously so much more complex by this, especially when you're talking over thousands of years. It's not just some mass migration of people when you're talking over thousands of years. And so, yeah, I think that's really key, is to get across those kind of more nuanced perspectives that have been developed in the field of archaeology over the last 100 years, and to start to think about how to integrate this new kind of evidence into that theoretical perspective and the way we explain and interpret the past. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah, it's been exciting too to see the field grow and become, incorporating of more voices. I think that's what any field needs, is having different voices and different opinions to talk to one another. And yeah.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Okay, so you also sent me some images. Let's see, you have the lovely Etruscan tomb, which I'm
Mm-hmm.
blanking on the tomb right now. I should know it because I've used it before. There we go.
Hmm. Yeah, so this is from Tarquinia, and this is the
That's
tomb of the leopards. And so we didn't study individuals from this particular tomb, but I really enjoyed this photo. I took this photo actually, which is, but I mean, it's similar to many others taken of this tomb. But yeah, just to sort of give people a visual representation of what some of these tombs are like, and then also to see how Etruscan individuals depicted themselves. So you can see these people here talking and yeah, feasting perhaps in this image. Um, yeah, so we were lucky enough in the Iron Age paper to study 12 individuals from Tarquinia, and there was also another paper that came out in 2021 by Cosmo Poss and his team, and that also talked about individuals at Tarquinia, and they also see a very heterogeneous set of individuals. And in fact, in one burial, there were 6 individuals, um, and they had, and I'll try and get the exact numbers, but there was ancestry from different parts of different individuals had ancestry from different parts of the Mediterranean. So I think 2 had ancestry similar to Levantine individuals. I think one from North Africa, one from Central Europe. And so it's just interesting to see there. And then at Kherkwan as well, which is the site in Tunisia, we had studied 12 individuals from there and saw 3 different ancestry clusters. And we had thought, oh, maybe this will somehow be reflected in where they're buried, in the tombs they're buried in. And then it didn't. And so that was interesting to see.
It's always good when you have these hypotheses and you're like, nope.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't correlate at all. Like I did my whole postdoc on looking at different animals in different, houses versus feasting areas, and they're all the same friggin' animal. Everywhere you go, it's just mostly goats. And so it's just like, well, that sucked. I just counted, I don't know how many tens of thousands of bones, and they're all the same age, same species. And so it's just like, So by the way, wait, do you know Carmen Esposito?
No, I don't. No.
Okay, because she's doing isotope analysis on some similar sites around Etruria. And,
amazing.
And so, yeah, I thought maybe you'd come across her because I think she's doing some stuff at Tarquinia as well.
Okay.
With human remains.
Yeah.
So if you come across her, be like, you heard of her from me. She's awesome. I was just at her wedding.
Yeah.
She's a really good archaeologist. She was here in Cardiff doing a postdoc, and now she has a Marie Curie in, I want to say Bologna, but I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll check.
Yeah.
And I've seen posts from Tarquinia about the ongoing work. So maybe she's doing it. So maybe I have heard of the work and
yeah, well, I think she's in the process. She just started her Marie Curie, so she's in the like last year. So she's in the process of working on it and publishing it. So it should be awesome
That's
stuff.
Awesome.
Okay, and then you have a lovely overhead image of this site. What are we looking at here?
This is Kherkwan. This is in the one in Tunisia that I was talking about before. And I did not take this, of course. This is from a film called Once Kherkwan. So it's a great film if you want to watch it. But so this is the site. This is an Iron Age site. And one of the reasons that it's so well known is that it's well preserved. Essentially, when I'm sure that many people here are familiar with the drama, if you will, between Rome and Carthage, the Punic Wars, and that a lot of Carthaginian or Punic cities in North Africa were destroyed. The ones that weren't destroyed were often built upon. So we don't actually have a lot of architecture preserved from Carthaginian towns, except for this one. This one was not destroyed. It was preserved. And so it's one of the best surviving examples of Punic architecture. And so I sort of liken it to Pompeii, that it's like we know so much about it because of how well preserved it is. Pompeii, is perhaps not a huge city. It's much smaller than Rome, but we know it because of its great preservation. And same for Kherkwan, that it's so well preserved, we get this glimpse into daily life that we wouldn't otherwise.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so that's part of the reason why you have so many samples from there is because of the preservation, and you can, okay. I was wondering actually, so I mean, Rome also destroyed Corinth, and we have all this historical record of it, but the excavations actually show that the time of abandonment was a lot shorter than we think. It doesn't look like it was a complete destruction, but in North Africa, we are seeing that showing up archaeologically, that more complete destruction. Okay. So is that what made you choose Italy and North Africa, was the Carthaginian Wars? What was the logic behind that? Because there's so many other areas in the Mediterranean as well that you could be comparing with Italy, or not without Italy even. So I'm just curious about the logic there.
Yeah, I mean so sort of the 2023 paper, the one you showed, and then a 2024 paper led by my colleagues Margaret Antonio and Clemens Weiss and Susanna Sawyer was sort of both outgrowths of that initial paper, the 2019 paper about Rome. And that came about, actually, we were really hoping to look at selection on different traits through time. And we, some of the folks on the team built, so like the PI I was working for, Jonathan Pritchard at Stanford, and Ron Panassi and Alfredo Copa, were excited about this idea of looking at one population through time. And we thought Rome or Central Italy would be a great place to do that because of the historical record, because of the long history of habitation and the intensive archaeological work that's been done there. But then, of course, we also realized that with so much mobility, that's not a great place to study selection, because essentially,
exactly. Because if you're seeing that, then that's a terrible place. So instead, your project sort of switched to just thinking about mobility then.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about the population history of Rome, and then also expanding to these neighboring regions that were.
Exactly. That makes sense. Do you have the same time depth in each of these cities in the regions around Rome, or is it each one's a little different?
No, each one's a bit different. Yeah. So the Iron Age paper just focused on the Iron Age really. So yeah, those three sites, Carquan, Sant'Embenia in Sardinia, and then Tarquinia in Italy, to look at essentially how people were moving around the central Mediterranean in that period. Yeah, and then my colleague Margaret's paper, the 2024 one, looked at mobility in the Mediterranean, essentially from the Iron Age to the present. And she sees a lot of mobility, yeah, then too. So, yeah.
People like to move and mingle. That's what they do. Okay, so you have one last slide, and then we'll talk about the Twitter stuff.
Right.
What are we looking at here? These are pretty cool.
Yeah. So these are is a photo taken in the Tarquinia Museum. So the museum that is associated with the tomb that we just saw, and with the series of tombs at Tarquinia. And I think one thing I like about this is visually, you might guess, oh, these are from Egypt, right? Because they're scarabs. These are scarabs that have seals or designs on the bottom of them. Yeah, so just another testament to how things are moving around the Mediterranean at this time. It's interesting to see that people are moving too.
That makes sense. So those scarabs were not made in Egypt. They're made locally and end up in those tombs locally?
I don't know where they're made, and maybe somebody would know where they're made, but they were found in Tarquinia.
Okay. So they probably were made in Egypt and then imported. But yeah, it shows examples of either the mobility of goods or the mobilities of sort of symbols and concepts and artifacts, ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But so now's the time to bring the trolls out. So yeah, in fact, a colleague of mine just emailed me this paper yesterday, and I was like, she's going to be on my live stream tomorrow. But
cool.
so you have a paper that's making its way through academia as well. But when I first saw it, it was on Twitter, and it was like, you were responding to someone who had misinterpreted the genetic results, which of course I imagine is something that must happen all the time as somebody who does both genetics and has an archaeological and historical perspective. So do you want to go into a little bit of how different interpretations in the public think about this kind of evidence, and how do we go about addressing that in an appropriate way, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was something we tried to be thoughtful of in writing and researching the paper too, to make sure that there can be a lot of misinformation online, even in sources that you might want to think of as trustworthy. So we even had to sort of evaluate sources, within our own team to say, is this representative of, I think especially when you're talking about Rome, there's a lot of different political interests in Rome, and I think sometimes, those can find their way into academia. So we had to sort of make sure that we were, I'm trying to think of how to put it, but essentially, and Rome's fascinating, of course. I mean, I'm fascinated with Rome, so it's fascinating, but there can be sort of, people who use the past to justify how they think the present should be, for various reasons. And so, I think that's something that's happened on.
Oh, for sure. Wasn't there that huge nature issue on this kind of, was it Nature or Science? I don't remember. It was about a year ago or 2 years ago, just on this very topic about how to address this, and how to, a couple of the essays at least had to do with how to make sure the public does not misuse this kind of evidence and interpret it in a way that is justified for violence or for other kind of negative, harmful impacts on people. And it's difficult, of course, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think Rome in particular, in fact, when I teach this to students, I've been lucky enough to teach classes about ancient DNA and ethics in ancient DNA. One perception that people have of Rome can come from movies and TV shows, and often in movies and TV shows, there's sort of a certain depiction of the population of Rome that might not be as diverse as it actually was in the past. And so that's something that I'll assign to my students as different articles and podcasts and videos. There's a great video that Samantha Bee, the comedian, does about sort of misconceptions of the populations of ancient Rome and Greece based on the statues. People are saying, oh, the statues are white.
Oh, yeah. Didn't she have Sarah Bond on for that? Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it was such a great, it was a really cool skit, or not skit, like I don't even know the right word for it, but there's the Lucas brothers, two comedians, visit a museum, the Met, I think, in New York, and sort of talk about the misconceptions about the populations of Greece and Rome, because statues sort of, many are made in marble, and so people have misinterpreted sometimes, as the populations of Greece and Rome being, white. And I use that in air quotes because I think these racial categories are not, not biological, and so we shouldn't be. I mean
Yeah, and
that's
I think that's important because I was just teaching a class on human evolution. It's just first year introductory class, but part of what we're talking about is genetics and stuff like that, and like, we're trying to. I'm struggling to try to explain the sharp line between species is not always very clear, right? When you're thinking way back in time to human evolution, we have lumpers and splitters and stuff like that, and then when we think about it in today's term, it's like, well, yeah, but population geneticists, they can't find any sharp distinction between what we call race either. It's not a biological thing that we can map out cleanly. And so it's therefore a cultural distinction. How would you, as somebody more familiar with genetics than me, explain that to people in the public or to first-year students, people who come in there with a more cultural opinion on these kind of topics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're exactly right to talk about it as a cultural thing and a social thing because it is important, right? It impacts people daily. The perceptions of race impact people daily, right? So you can't say it doesn't exist. It does exist and has real lived implications for lots of people. But from a biological perspective, it's not a biological category, and it's not a constructive category. Biologically, I think one thing that has happened is people will try and sort of map continents onto races. And so that's actually something we try and push back on, even in these papers, instead of saying, or all the time talking about, Southern Europe and North Africa, it's actually much more meaningful to talk about the Roman world as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean. That would have been more meaningful to the people at the time. And that's also, is not feeding into these ideas of race thinking that aren't meaningful to begin with. So
Yeah.
that's sort of a little way to.
And I thought I saw some people on Twitter that were like, because you're explaining, hey, this population is fairly diverse. We're seeing this increase in heterogeneity. We're seeing this increase in sort of the diversity of ancestry within these individuals that we're studying. And they're like, yeah, you mean Eastern Mediterranean? That means just Greece. And it's like, no, what does Eastern Mediterranean mean? It means, I imagine, parts of North Africa, parts of Southwest Asia, and parts of Southeast Europe. And so to us, it's people from 3 different continents, right? That are moving there and mingling and then moving around elsewhere, and it's such a tiresome thing to push back on because people just want to see it in these black and white categories or these boxes, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to reflect and just even on how the language we pick, can either sort of push back against categories that are unhelpful or reinforce them. And so it's good to be, thoughtful about that, but challenging too. And I mean, it takes, within our teams too, we have a lot of conversations about this to try and make sure we're thoughtful about it.
Okay. Do you think about it also in terms of your public engagement? Were you very intentional about replying there? I mean, I think you did it, at least I saw it twice, I think, and both times your tweets went fairly viral. And so they were seen by a lot of people. Was that what were your thoughts on how to because I'm sure you also got a lot of trolling in response at the same time too. So what are your thoughts on all that? How do we handle that in the public venue like that?
Yeah, and I feel like I should ask you that as well because I feel like you have a great handle.
Also differently, but yeah.
I feel like, especially for those tweets, these specific tweets, and what they wwere suggesting was that the time of the rise of Rome, what we've been calling, the Iron Age here, but this sort of rise of Rome period was, a very homogenous time period, and then as Rome became more diverse, it fell, and it's sort of the narrative that people are spreading on Twitter, and then they have sort of this agenda of an anti-immigration agenda. And I think one thing that, first of all, it's misinterpreting our paper. The most diverse time period is late antiquity that we see. So after Rome has quote unquote fall. I don't like to talk about the fall of Rome either because I don't think it was such a simple event.
It wasn't at all, but yeah.
But that's even missing the time, the sort of when we're seeing is the most diverse is this, early medieval, late antiquity period, but also the Iron Age was incredibly diverse. Even in the mid-Iron Age, the early Iron Age, and this might have been important for the rise of Rome. These connections that Central Italy had with places across the Mediterranean. So I wouldn't, I think that's something that it's just good for people to hear, to know. So they're not just getting it through the lens of these people who've interpreted it a certain way, and then it might be, papers can be behind paywalls. For the Iron Age paper, we have it on bioarchive, so then you can go and read the preprint, which is very similar to the one that was published, but yeah, it could be behind paywall. So I always think it's important to reply and say, oh, that's not what we saw. The Iron Age wasn't homogeneous. The most diverse period didn't precede the fall of Rome, and
Yeah,
any of
exactly. And so here's the thread for people, at least one of them, that I was able to find very quickly. And so this is you sort of pushing back on a misinterpretation of the study in a sense. And yeah, I think that that's really important. I think, like you said, I think even if it's behind it, is this one behind a paywall? I don't know because I have access to it, so I don't even know. But
no, it's not. The preprint at least is not, and yeah,
yeah,
I think the paper. Yeah, I'm not sure about the paper, but the preprint isn't, and it's very similar.
I think your thread was very valuable because it really did get that kind of thing across in a very clear set of language. It's what led to me inviting you to come on here and think about that. And so I think that that's that your ability to step up and write in that clear fashion. Were you worried about doing so from your university or from your colleagues, or were you just sort of worried about trolls? Was there any sort of worry there, or it was like, we're going to stand up and explain this stuff to this group of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think seeing, that some of the tweets from this person did get a lot of attention, it felt important, to correct, because I think, not saying something would be problematic there. And in that particular instance, there was a new preprint that had come out from Francesco, I think Ravicini, and then Eugenia Anastasio. And yeah, and they had this new genome that was from, I think, the Republican period, and then also did this good context, this really nice archaeological contextualization of this pre-Roman period. Yeah, and so it was frustrating to see that get twisted, right? The work we'd done previously and then this new preprint sort of get twisted in this way. And yeah, maybe I felt defensive of them too, like, don't do this to my colleagues, but
But I mean, this is the problem. It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately because I engage more publicly, and it's like I don't quite get it, but for some reason, when it comes to history, unlike many other topics, it's a topic, and I guess it's not entirely true, but maybe I'm just biased because I do history, but it seems to me like everybody just thinks they can do history and they understand history. And so it's very tough to be able to speak up because everybody just has their own opinions about history. We've all learned some history, at least to some level. We all have the little folklore and myths about history that we've learned. And so it just seems like everybody has an opinion and is willing to express it, which makes it very difficult because you're saying, look, I've actually studied all these genomes. Like, if you want to talk about migration in Iron Age and in the Roman period in Italy and North Africa and the Mediterranean, I'm your girl, right? That's what you can say. You're like, I'm the fucking shit here. And it's like, but you're not the only awesome person to be able to discuss it, but you're certainly among that group of people that can discuss that in detail. I mean, there's maybe several dozen people in the world that have published on this kind of stuff and can discuss it and express it on a sort of synthetic level. And then you're talking to someone random on Twitter, and it's just like, what do you do? Yeah, it's so weird sometimes. Yeah.
yeah. And I think like it can be so exciting to see, different people's takes and interpretations, and then become sort of crosses a boundary into the where one might want to step in when somebody's co-opting this for like a hateful ideology, right? That's and how do you have advice for how to engage or
I mean, I think that in the end, if somebody's wrapped up in an ideology that's anti-science, you're never going to convince them. So I think that's not true because I have convinced some of them, and I'm sure you have as well with your tweet and stuff like that. But that's not your primary audience you're trying to reach. What you're trying to reach are people that are actually interested in evidence, and you're trying to explain to them how these methods actually work and what they actually say. And I think when you explain that clearly, you hit a lot more people than you think. And so, I sort of just try to imagine some mythical neutral audience, and it hits far more than just that mythical neutral audience. It also hits people that actually believe some of this stuff because many of them are just misinformed, not completely ideologically wrapped up in it. Because, I mean, let's just be honest. It's easier to find misinformation on ancestry than is the actual scholarship on it. There are some people like Adam Rutherford has done a really good job. Jenny Raft does a really good job at addressing the public, and there's certainly a few others as well. But it's not, unless, I mean, come on, this is all such new research. Unless you went to university relatively recently, or you're an academic that engages in this kind of stuff, or you're really an enthusiast that engages in this kind of stuff, you're not going to know much about more recent approaches to ancient DNA, because it's so recent that we've had next generation sequencing that can do this kind of stuff, and these new data sets are coming out, and so the majority of the public has no friggin' idea, and so therefore you actually stepping up and doing that, it does help inform, and the more you and other people and all these other people do that, the more it'll get out there and help teach this stuff to the people that matter. I hope also one thing that came across is by doing that, you don't just reach ordinary people, you reach other people that can help amplify your message, like having you on here, or a journalist that'll then get in touch with you, or other kinds of people that'll then go read your paper and maybe make a YouTube video or a podcast. Some will invite you on, some will translate it into their own way of doing it, but hopefully in a more nuanced way because they've read your stuff and seen it. And so I think that's valuable too. I think just speaking up automatically starts attracting that kind of stuff because you are one of those experts, right?
Well, thanks for saying that. And yeah, one thing that and like this whole weekend and this all the work that you do to communicate archaeology, it's so important to remember archaeology is fun and people want to learn, and it's like so much of the content is inaccessible, right? There are paywalls, there's stuff, and so to make it accessible and yeah, I mean, it's like such a fun thing that people want to learn about, and so it's awesome that you're doing.
I mean, that's how I found it, is most of the people just, I mean, look, when you think about something like, I don't know, Atlantis or something like that, the most accessible stuff is not scholarship. Because there's no real scholarship on Atlantis for a long time, because we all know it's, other than people that study ancient philosophy or the historiography of ideas, because there's no reason to study Atlantis as a possibility because we know it's not real. And so it's just like, therefore that stuff isn't accessible. It's people who study historiography of ideas, which some of that's a little accessible, or it's people who study ancient philosophy, and that's filled with jargon. And so, it's the same thing with ancient DNA. I mean, our concepts on ethnicity and nationality and identity are way behind the times. Like just people my age, I'm like 40, think about it, they finished university almost 20 years ago. So, their knowledge of how this sort of genetic revolution has an impact on our understanding of who we are as different people, it's not really disseminated to adults at all, unless they closely try to pay attention. So it's just like something brand new to them, and they're just misinformed because they don't know all these new sort of approaches and the ways that we categorize this stuff. One of the most common misconceptions I see is like, about Neanderthal DNA, because it's just like statues are associated, white statues with white skin, Neanderthals are Europeans somehow. And it's like, no, we now know that, humans that left Africa, different populations went back into Africa, and pretty much everybody has Neanderthal DNA. It's just different percentages. And so it's just like, we're all descended from Neanderthals to some greater or lesser degree. And so, yeah, I think just trying to constantly express that, because sometimes the first thing that comes out is what gets heard, but it's before we've refined it with new information. And so.
Yeah, that's point. And that, I think Europe isn't even the region with the highest Neanderthal ancestry. So it's people sort of, it's similar to the Rome stuff where people might both be sort of co-opting things for problematic reasons, but then also misinterpreting the science at the same time to fit that, right? And so it's like, it can be easier to speak out on the specific correcting the science, but I think by doing that, you're also hopefully helping push back on misuses of it too. So.
And that's where some of my own research into how to talk with the public, I think also, like, so what you did was more of a straight up debunk in a sense. And my advice is you want to do that at times. And when especially if you have a hot button issue, which can get some traction like you did, it can go viral, and therefore you can teach people. You can use that as an opportunity, let's say, to get things across, especially if it's something that will be controversial in the culture wars, let's say. But on the other hand, of far more value is the harder job of just trying to share this stuff naturally, And that's a lot harder. As soon as you say, new paper out, everybody's like, snooze fest, like, new paper out, who's going to care about that except for academics? And so then you have to think about a hook. What's the kind of hook to then write a thread where you're not responding? Because there's a lot of research that shows debunking and responding. Part of the problem is to do that, you have to first repeat that false claim. And since you first repeat it, what sticks in people's heads is the first thing they hear. And so debunking can actually lead to spreading that misinformation, excuse me,
Yeah.
even further. And so what that really means is we need to pre-bunk. And
Yeah.
what is pre-bunking other than just teaching people? So then you end up thinking, all right, how do I do that in like the public sphere? Well, you need to figure out how to grab them and hook them so that they want to learn that sort of topic. And so, yeah, so that's the sort of the tough challenge in a sense. Then we start thinking, how do we do that? And I think we have the training to communicate effectively to the public. We just need to approach it like we approach a classroom, in a sense, with learning outcomes in mind. But I think we have less good training in terms of how to hook the public. And so that's something where we need more thought on. And I think the more we speak up, though, as a community, the better off we are about doing that, because we're showing how interesting this stuff is. I don't know, what did you think of the news coverage of some of this stuff? I'm curious about that. We obviously saw a little bit how you responded on Twitter. What about how the media covered your paper?
Yeah, so we were lucky enough for the 2019 paper, the one about Rome, to talk with some journalists. So that was really helpful to sort of talk to folks and get it worked out. Because I think, like you were saying, the hook is so important. And I think for us, we were so cautious, right? So then you can almost be pushing back against hooks. But we were so lucky. The Stanford media office made a short video. It was a cartoon actually
Oh, cool.
well, I mean, yeah, it was like a minute and a half or something, and they had a few of us come and voice it over, and then they had some of our Italian colleagues voice it over in Italian too, which was great. So we got it out in 2 languages, and then Alfredo Coppa and Michaela Lucci and a few of our other colleagues in Rome hosted an event there as well. And so I think that was really nice to be able to, yeah, to try and say like, okay, how do you say your results in a minute and a half in a cartoon? And it was like, oh no, like, you know, it was hard to do and to figure out what to say. And we had to record it so many times. But it was also a really good exercise to say, you know, what would make this accessible for all ages, and what would, you know, and I'm really glad we did that. And I think that's something that, you know, I wish there was more time and funding to do, because it was such a valuable thing to have. And yeah, and I think it led to other people covering that story, having a basic sense of what is our story, what are we trying to say? And then if they wanted to go deeper and get more nuanced or talk about the sites or talk about the specific time periods, then they could, but they had this backbone of, of content
Yeah.
that they could
I think
figure
that's
out.
really key. And I think also, like I said, I think being on social media and accessible, like actually when you just writing a little Twitter thread can be very valuable, because you're contextualizing what you said in more dense academic jargon into more clear language, and you're signposting to others how it can be sort of used. In fact, I wish Twitter was not dying, because I actually think as a medium, I mean, by dying, it's not dying, but you know what I mean, becoming what it's
Yeah.
becoming. And because as a medium, it's really valuable for us because it's so public and open, and it's one place, and now it's all fragmented. And at the same time, I think the forced concision of writing short little tweets into a thread, it teaches us those practices of how to get your points across quickly in short sentences with a few images, which is like making a little cartoon after all, right? That's a minute and a half.
Yeah.
And so for me, a lot of my public engagement started by writing Twitter threads. That's how I started doing it, and that was what got me to actually learn how to write in many ways, because of that forced concision.
Yeah.
And you just have to be able to do that so quickly and so clearly that you'll never write a Twitter thread that's successful if you can't write in that way. And so yeah, I think that's the goal here, is to just, we have to keep speaking up, and there needs to be more academic rewards for doing so, because you know, funding is being cut, departments are being slashed. And how else do we protect our discipline if we don't actually appeal to the public that we need to be funded to do this, right? It's just, we will lose this battle if we can't communicate with the public. It's a real issue in my mind. With genetics, you're lucky. There's a lot of funding going towards genetics, but a lot of other archaeological subdisciplines aren't so lucky, and historical disciplines. So yeah, so I think speaking up is what we all have to start doing, without a doubt. Okay. And so what do you want to end on? What's some takeaway points for what's coming next, or how can we think about this kind of research in our own sense of who we are and why it matters today?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think I, would encourage people to, I'm trying to think. I mean, I guess, ancient DNA, I think is, becoming more interdisciplinary, and there's more studies. So I do hope people feel, feel like they can if they see a paper, to read it, and maybe even, actually, one thing I have my students do is will I taught a class that was sort of introduction to ancient DNA, and so we it was sort of students from all different disciplines, and we would learn some computational methods. We would read papers, so we'd talk about sort of the work that goes into it, and bridging disciplines, and then they'd also learn some computational methods, and I'd encourage them to to like work with some of the data and reinterpret it from their own expertise, and a lot of them would say, oh, I'd be interested to see if all sorts of, they had just such great questions, but then they'd be like, oh, I'm sure somebody else has already done this. And a lot of times they hadn't. I think there's so much new data, and it's so important to have different voices, different perspectives, different expertise coming at this, and I think most of them said, oh, I think this wouldn't work as a final project because somebody's done it before. And it's like, no, they haven't. Like, you should totally do this. And so, yeah, I mean, I would hope to encourage everybody, not just people in classes, but people who read stuff, to make connections between papers or between whatever their expertise is, and what they're reading. Because I think there's, so many more conversations we could be having about this.
I fully agree. I mean, for the introduction to this event, I had JT Lewis on, and I did a game, which I do with my archaeological theory class, where it's like, what discipline does not relate with archaeology? And there's just nothing. Because we are just as interdisciplinary as you can get. Any single study can be applied to archaeological evidence, but we still need to understand that archaeological context and the historical ways in which we've interpreted archaeology, so that we can actually, apply it properly, or in a way that makes sense, is maybe the right way to put it, in a way that actually is justified. And so, so I think that that's really key. Is there is so much to do, and that's something that I think students don't realize, is oftentimes their ideas, which they sort of dream up, they're really good ideas to then turn into a thesis or a dissertation or whatever, and it's or even a longer term project. And so it's just, there is still so much research to be done. And especially in something like ancient DNA. I mean, I remember arguing with somebody probably 4 or 5 years ago on Twitter, and they're like, yeah, but one genome captures so much ancestry. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but at the same time, having like 100 genomes from different kinds of contexts at a site and different sites captures much more. And so there's still so much, and I think your paper is a great example of that, right? Where you can see that heterogeneity. Some of my work on isotopes from animal remains is like that too, because people have only been able to publish like the seasonal sequence on a sheep for like 5 of them from a site, or 6 of them from a site, and it shows like you have 4 different teeth and all 4 of them are managed differently. Well, then we need a much larger sample size, even though it provides a lot of detail, to understand if there are actual management patterns or something like that. And so I imagine as we get hundreds and hundreds of these genomes sequenced, we'll have a much clearer picture of so many patterns that aren't even lurking in the data set that you have. Yeah. And so I think that'll be cool. I guess that also becomes much more of a statistical challenge. Are you more on the bioinformatics side of things, or are you more on the actual sequencing and the lab work? Which aspect of ancient DNA are you working more on?
Both, sort of.
Okay.
Yeah, so I did the lab work first, was my first foray into ancient DNA. But yeah, now I do the analyses. I certainly don't do methods development. That's beyond me. But using the existing methods is is something that I do and enjoy. And like I said, in my class, we had students from all sorts of different disciplines, including students who didn't have computational backgrounds, learn some of that. I mean, some of that can be, the point being, I don't want people to be daunted by, saying, oh, this is a hurdle I can't learn. I actually think, these computational methods sometimes are quite user-friendly, and people actually can approach them, which is, I think great. And it was great for me too, to have colleagues to learn from and learn how to do these. Yeah.
That makes sense. So we do have a couple new questions that have come in. One, I guess quickly, I think you sort of addressed this, but just to remind people, how did you get focused on Rome? What drew you to it?
Oh, I mean, I think it was our teams talking about, so we had our different teams that ended up being involved in this paper. Talking about what would be interesting. And so it was this initial selection idea. So I think part of it was just the people involved. Alfredo Coppo was based in Rome, and I think was excited about having a study dedicated to that region in particular. And Michela Lucci, and Alessandro Sperduti, Mauro Rubini, Luca Bondioli, and these folks sort of curated this data set to try and get a coverage of time periods. To study initially selection, but then that didn't happen, but then population history. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the next question, which is they want to hear more about that transition from the Bronze Age to the Roman era, and how does that component vary from individual to individual? How much of these genomes are preserved in our DNA? I think the answer to that is these are complete genomes, right? So, but it depends on the inheritance of it, which is going to have a lot of complicated factors. Okay, so do you
Yeah,
want to go into some more depth then?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, for the genomes we were looking at, we used actually whole genome sequencing, which is a little bit different than, yeah, anyways, this is a bit nuanced, but there's a couple different ways of sequencing ancient genomes. You can either do capture, which is essentially where you're fishing for large parts of the genome, and that can be really good, especially if you have like low preservation. You're getting the human DNA when maybe you wouldn't be able to with whole genome sequencing. We used whole genome sequencing, and the nice thing about that is you are getting the entire genome, and so there's trade-offs to both. I mean, sometimes it's not possible. We were lucky in the preservation that we were able to do
That's
that.
good, yeah.
But so yeah, it was whole genome sequencing that we used. So I
Okay.
don't know if that was the question exactly. I think that might not
Well, I guess
quite
they're
have.
also looking for some more detail on that transition from Bronze Age to the Roman period, in a sense, in Italy and North Africa.
Well, yeah, so we were talking when we were defining, it's interesting because it's difficult to define periods in a world that's really interconnected, the Mediterranean world, when you have, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the time for this chronologically is starting earlier than in the Western Mediterranean. But so we define the Iron Age as 1000 BCE to about 1 CE, and that is actually quite big. Like you could definitely refine that more, and especially in Rome, talking about the Republican period and the different time periods. Yeah, but this is a time when, as we were talking about earlier, that sailing is becoming more common. And so in central Italy, you're seeing people from, for instance, North Africa, from the Eastern Mediterranean. So that would be like the Levant, Egypt, Anatolia, Greece, and from the Western Mediterranean. So like, yeah, North Africa or Iberia, like Morocco, that side of North Africa.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just a real nice melting pot, let's say.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think, yeah, even before Rome, I think there have been other, not maybe in this recent Twitter situation, but in previous Twitter situations, people had suggested a lot of the heterogeneity came from the imperial expansion of Rome. And we're seeing that it was before that people were moving sort of not by force alone, right? That's what some people had suggested. And
Yeah, and it's actually far more nuanced than just that. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. All right, this is really cool stuff. I will continue reading along, and there's so much more of this coming out that really impacts, I don't do as much Roman stuff, but from the Greek world that impacts my own research, and so it's fascinating to see these kind of pictures coming out and coming together. So cool. Thank you so much. And
thanks so much for having me.
yeah, of course, and I hope to have you back again in the future when you have another paper come out. And
Awesome.
yeah, it'll be really good, and then we can, and maybe at some point I think it might be worthwhile to think about putting together a good video on ancient DNA, maybe just in the Mediterranean or something, with a group of you to try to get some of this stuff across. Yeah.
That would be fantastic. And thanks for doing this whole weekend. I mean, I've been following along, and it's such a great
Good.
event.
I
Thanks to
know,
you and
there's
the
so many good people participating. It's really, really phenomenal to see. All
Yeah,
right.
so thank you. Awesome
Thank you
to
so
have.
much, and it was good to meet you over Zoom. Yeah.
Likewise, thanks.
Ciao.
Rhymes and riddles, tickle, tickle, giggles, squiggle, jiggle, fiddle, flint, pun, dibble. Rhymes and riddles, tickle, tickle, giggles.